She always believed kindness could never lead to crime, until the day Mrs. Bloxby bent the rules. This is Agatha Raisin, and the day Mrs. Bloxby bent the rules. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cosy corner feel even warmer. Early spring in Carsely had that sly, deceitful quality of pretending to be kind. The hedgerows wore a faint blush of green, the sky a thin, watery blue, but the wind still had claws. Agatha Raisin, armed with her leopard print scarf and an expression that suggested she had already lost patience with the season, marched toward the parish hall for the first council meeting of the year. Inside, the place smelled of floor polish, wet umbrellas, and barely concealed resentment, the true perfume of rural democracy. Mrs. Fremont, that self-appointed guardian of decency, was already seated, lips pursed as if she'd bitten into something moral. The vicar arranged his notes at the front with the air of a man long resigned to disappointment. Agatha took her seat beside Mrs. Bloxby, who smiled her usual gentle smile, the one that always made Agatha feel half scolded and half forgiven. "This year," announced the vicar, "we must decide where the proceeds from the Easter jumble sale shall go." "The Historical Society," Mrs. Fremont declared at once. "The poor dear church roof has waited long enough." "The church roof," murmured Agatha, "has waited since the 15th century. It can manage another year." A few titters rippled round the hall, but Mrs. Bloxby, to everyone's surprise, cleared her throat and spoke. "I think we should consider giving the funds to the Murfield Women's Refuge. They've lost their county grant." The silence that followed was almost scandalous. Mrs. Fremont's eyebrows climbed towards sainthood. The vicar blinked. Agatha turned, astonished. Mrs. Bloxby rarely contradicted anyone, least of all the vicar. "A refuge?" Mrs. Fremont repeated. "For that sort of person?" "For women in difficulty," Mrs. Bloxby said quietly. "Surely we must look after our own first," the vicar added, shifting uneasily. Agatha, sensing drama, sat back with relish. "I didn't know compassion had a postcode," she murmured. The meeting dissolved into polite warfare, Mrs. Fremont defending heritage, Mrs. Bloxby defending humanity, the vicar trying to defend his authority and losing ground with every sentence. By the end, no decision had been made, but gossip had been given wings. When they emerged into the chill afternoon, Agatha felt oddly invigorated. For once Mrs. Bloxby had shown steel, and Agatha admired her for it. "You were magnificent," she told her. "You should do that more often." Mrs. Bloxby smiled faintly. "Oh, I only said what seemed right." "Which in Carsely," said Agatha, "is practically a criminal act." They parted at the corner by the vicarage, Agatha's heels clicking on the wet pavement, Mrs. Bloxby walking home through the drizzle with her gentle air of purpose. That evening, while Agatha debated whether to open a bottle of wine or write another lonely email to Charles she'd never send, she noticed movement outside her cottage window. Mrs. Bloxby again, but not alone. She was hurrying under a large black umbrella beside a young woman with pale hair and a frightened look. The stranger clutched a small holdall and kept glancing over her shoulder as though the rain itself might be following. Agatha, curiosity prickling like nettles, watched them vanish into the vicarage lane. Minutes later, her phone rang. "Aggie," cried Roy Silver, his voice bright and smug. "You won't believe it. I've just landed the PR for a new organic gin brand. London's positively mad for authenticity." "How thrilling," said Agatha, staring at the wet window pane. "Does authenticity come in litre bottles now?" Roy laughed without listening. "Anyway, how's village life? Solved any murders lately?" "Not yet," said Agatha, "but the night's young." When she hung up, the lane outside had gone still again, but she couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Bloxby's anxious glance. Why would Carsley's mildest woman shelter a stranger, and look so secretive about it? By the time she went to bed, Agatha had decided that nothing good ever came of umbrellas at dusk. Next morning brought the usual assortment of domestic defeats, burnt toast, missing post, and the faint guilt of knowing she had no reason to wear lipstick but did so anyway. She opened her front door just as Doris Simpson, her cleaner, appeared with the week's gossip disguised as small talk. "They say Mrs. Bloxby's got company," Doris began, eyes bright. "A poor girl, looks half-starved. Mrs. Fremont saw her buying milk at the shop and said she didn't look respectable." "Mrs. Fremont thinks respectability is a health condition," Agatha muttered. "Well, the vicar's not best pleased. Told the butcher his wife's overstepped her role, and you know how that'll sound once it's been through his mother." Doris sniffed. "Mark my words, there'll be trouble." Agatha's interest sharpened like a pen-nib. Trouble was her favourite season. By late afternoon, she found herself accidentally passing the vicarage on the way to the shop. Mrs. Bloxby's curtains were drawn. A shadow moved behind them. Agatha stood long enough in the drizzle to look suspicious herself, then retreated before the vicar spotted her. Back home, she reheated soup she didn't want and told herself she wouldn't interfere. Not tonight. Not yet. Then came the flash of blue light against her window pane, the soft, unmistakable reflection of a police car turning into the lane. Agatha set down her spoon. The siren had been cut, but the silence it left behind was louder than any alarm. Whatever Mrs. Bloxby had done, or whoever that trembling woman was, Carsely would know by morning, and Agatha Raisin, curse her curiosity, intended to know before that. The next morning brought drizzle of the most determined kind, that fine, mean sort which seeps through umbrellas and into bones. Agatha Raisin, who prided herself on facing life like a general facing enemy fire, felt the grey sky was personal. She had slept badly, her mind looping round the vision of Mrs. Bloxby hurrying through the lane with that pale, frightened girl. By breakfast, curiosity had ripened into strategy. A friendly visit, Agatha muttered to herself, slipping on her best tweed coat. After all, one ought to check on a friend's moral well-being. At the vicarage gate she paused, schooling her expression into benevolent concern. She knocked twice and entered before being invited, as only Agatha could. Inside, the air smelled of tea, furniture polish, and faint distress. Mrs. Bloxby rose from her chair with a mild start, smoothing her apron. "Agatha, how lovely to see you. Do sit down." "Thank you, my dear," said Agatha, eyes darting like radar. "Thought I'd pop in. Such dreadful weather. You look pale. Overworked, perhaps?" Before Mrs. Bloxby could answer, the young woman appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray. She was fair and slight, with the skittish movements of a startled fawn. Her sleeve slipped back, revealing a yellowing bruise on her wrist. Agatha's curiosity sharpened to a blade. "Oh, this is Claire," Mrs. Bloxby said quickly. "A friend of a friend, staying for a day or two." "How cosy," said Agatha. "I don't recall her from the jumble sale committee." Claire smiled faintly, pouring tea with trembling hands. I'm not local." "Obviously," said Agatha, then regretted it at once. She softened her tone. "Terrible weather for travelling. You must be chilled." "It's kind of you," Claire murmured, but her voice held that frightened brittleness Agatha recognised from stray cats and guilty teenagers. Mrs. Bloxby offered scones with unusual vigour, steering conversation toward the garden, the vicar's sermon, and anything safely unimportant. But Agatha, being Agatha, refused to be managed. "How did you meet?" she asked. "Through a parish contact," Mrs. Bloxby replied smoothly. "Claire needed a place to rest before sorting a few personal matters." Agatha smiled tightly. "I'm sure the parish is thrilled to expand into social work." Mrs. Bloxby's eyes were calm, but her teacup rattled slightly as she set it down. Agatha noticed, and filed it away. Then, as Claire reached for the sugar bowl, her elbow caught the vicar's sermon notes. A splash of jam painted Leviticus in raspberry. Claire gasped, her composure cracking. Tears sprang uninvited to her eyes. "I'm so sorry, I'll clean it. Please." "It's only paper, dear," said Mrs. Bloxby, rising to fetch a cloth. Agatha, watching, saw panic far too deep for a blot of jam. Something heavier pressed on that girl's conscience. When Agatha took her leave, Mrs. Bloxby followed her to the door. "Do forgive the fuss," she said quietly. "Claire's had a trying time." "So I see," said Agatha. "Well, if you need anything—" "Thank you, but she'll be fine." Agatha hesitated. "You're sure you know what you're doing?" "Quite sure," said Mrs. Bloxby, with a calmness that was answer enough, and not the reassuring kind. That afternoon, Agatha drove to Mercester under a sky the colour of tin. She had arranged to meet Bill Wong for coffee, partly to pump him for information, partly because Bill's level-headed patience made her feel almost respectable. He arrived in his usual quiet way, shrugging off a damp jacket. "You look pleased with yourself," he said. "Plotting something?" "Don't be absurd," Agatha replied. "I'm simply being neighbourly. Tell me, Bill, heard of anyone new in Carsely? A young woman, fair hair, nerves of jelly?" He frowned. "Why do you ask?" "Curiosity. Purely moral curiosity." Bill sighed, stirring his tea. You've heard of the Cheltenham Helping Hands Foundation? Charity lot. All newsletters and bad biscuits. What about it? They've reported missing funds. A woman called Claire Evans handled the accounts. She's wanted for questioning, vanished 2 days ago. Agatha's cup froze halfway to her lips. Claire Evans? Bill caught her look. You've seen her? Not necessarily. There are hundreds of Claires. It's like being named Susan in the 60s. Agatha, she leaned forward. And if I'd seen her, which I'm not saying I have, what's she supposed to have done? Fiddled the biscuit tin? It's serious, said Bill, and £10,000 worth. The papers will have it soon. So if you do happen to see her, don't get involved. Get involved? I'm insulted. Good, said Bill dryly. Stay that way. Agatha watched him leave, her mind already whirring like a wasp trapped in a jar. Mrs. Bloxby, the soul of propriety, harbouring a fugitive. Impossible. And yet, hadn't she seen that bruise, that fear? By the time Agatha drove back to Carsely, dusk had soaked the village in silver gloom. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys. The vicarage windows glowed softly behind lace curtains. She parked outside her cottage, telling herself she would not go meddling. Not tonight. Instead, she poured a glass of wine, sat by the window, and pretended to read. The wind rattled the hedge. Somewhere in the lane a fox barked. Then came the scream, high, sharp, unmistakably human, followed by the crash of a dustbin and the frantic scuffle of feet. Agatha was on her doorstep in seconds, heart thudding. The lane lay empty except for the lamplight trembling on wet stone. A scarf fluttered near the gate, pale blue silk embroidered with the initials C.E. Agatha stooped, fingers cold as she lifted it. The faintest trace of perfume lingered, lavender and panic. She looked toward the darkened vicarage, where one window still glowed. "Oh, Mrs. Bloxby," she murmured, "what on earth have you done?" Morning arrived with deceptive serenity, a mild mist, the scent of wet daffodils, and the faint promise of sunlight somewhere far beyond reach. Carsely looked innocent, which in Agatha Raisin's experience meant trouble was about to start. She had been halfway through her second cup of coffee when Doris Simpson arrived, face flushed and eyes bulging with importance. "Oh, Mrs. Raisin, you'll never guess," Doris gasped, barely setting down her cleaning bag. "There's a body behind the church." Agatha nearly choked. "A what?" "A body. Mrs. Fremont. Stone cold, poor soul. They say her neck's all marked, like someone's throttled her." Doris leaned forward, thrilled by her own horror. "And her handbag's missing. Reverend Bloxby's called the police." Agatha's coffee cooled forgotten. "When?" "Found her this morning behind the vestry door. I only know because Mrs. Mason told me. She heard it from the milkman, and he saw the vicar on the phone looking white as chalk." Agatha was already reaching for her coat. "Don't go down there," Doris warned, eyes gleaming. "I most certainly will," said Agatha, with the air of one marching into destiny. "Someone must bring order to the chaos." Outside, the village buzzed with excitement, a swarm of whispers disguised as concern. Agatha's heels clipped briskly across the cobbles as she approached the churchyard, where yellow tape now fluttered across the lich gate like grim bunting. 2 constables stood guard, one looking far too young to shave. Bill Wong appeared from behind the vicarage hedge, notebook in hand, expression grim. "Oh no," he said flatly, "not you again." "Good morning to you too," said Agatha. "I was merely on my way to investigate. Yes, I'm aware." Bill sighed. "Keep your distance, Aggie. This is serious." "You think I don't realize that? Who found her?" "The verger. Came early to set up for communion. Mrs. Fremont was lying just behind the vestry. No sign of a struggle, just bruising and her bag gone. We'll need to run prints, check for robbery, though the handbag's disappearance feels deliberate." "Deliberate," Agatha repeated, eyes narrowing. "And Claire Evans?" Bill's jaw tightened. "What about her?" "I just thought—" "Don't," he interrupted. "Leave her out of it. She's not a suspect until we know anything. And before you ask, yes, we'll speak to Mrs. Bloxby. Kindly don't coach her first." Agatha raised her chin. "I wouldn't dream of interfering." "Of course not," Bill muttered. By the time Agatha reached the vicarage, the place was in uproar. Parish ladies had already arrived with casseroles and condolences, as though death were a social engagement requiring baked goods. Mrs. Bloxby met her at the door, pale but composed, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "Oh, Agatha," she whispered. "It's dreadful. Poor Mrs. Fremont. She'd been here only yesterday, dropping off leaflets for the jumble sale." "And now she's the main attraction," Agatha said grimly. "Please don't be flippant." "I'm not," Agatha said, softening. "I'm sorry. Are you all right?" Mrs. Bloxby hesitated. "As well as one can be. The police have been asking about last night, whether we saw or heard anything." Agatha's eyes flicked instinctively toward the staircase. "And Claire?" "She's gone," Mrs. Bloxby said quietly. "Her things are still here, but she left early, or late, I'm not sure which. I heard the gate around midnight and thought it was the wind." "Left after the scream?" Mrs. Bloxby looked stricken. "You heard that?" "Hard not to. Sounded like something from a Hammer film. And you didn't check?" "The vicar was asleep. I didn't want to wake him, or make matters worse if it was nothing." Agatha pursed her lips. "Well, it wasn't nothing." The vicar emerged then, stiff-backed and clearly out of his depth. "Mrs. Raisin," he said with forced courtesy, "I would prefer it if villagers refrained from spreading tales. The police are handling matters." "Of course," said Agatha, all innocence. "I merely came to support Mrs. Bloxby." He gave her a look that said he'd rather she supported someone else. "Thank you, but silence would be the greater kindness." Agatha managed not to laugh. The vicar always spoke as though delivering a sermon to the morally faint. When he withdrew, Mrs. Bloxby sighed. "He means well, but he doesn't understand how people are. They'll talk regardless." "Then let's make sure they talk sense," said Agatha. She glanced toward the sideboard, where a half-packed suitcase sat open, Claire's no doubt, a scarf draped over it, embroidered initials C.E. glinting in the light. The same scarf Agatha had found the night before. "She left this behind?" Mrs. Bloxby nodded. "And her purse, oddly enough. Only some clothes missing." "Oh, Agatha, what if she's frightened?" "Or guilty," Agatha murmured. Mrs. Bloxby flinched. "You don't really think—" "I don't know what to think yet, but I do know you're not telling me everything." "It's not my secret to tell," said Mrs. Bloxby softly. Agatha studied her, torn between irritation and reluctant respect. Her friend's gentleness could be infuriatingly steadfast. "Fine," she said at last, "but don't expect me to sit idle while people I care about get strangled." Back at her cottage, Agatha lasted precisely 12 minutes before breaking her vow of discretion. She picked up the phone and dialed Charles Fraith. He answered on the third ring, his voice smooth as butter. "Aggie, darling, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Murder," she said. "How romantic." "Not that sort. Mrs. Fremont's dead." A pause, then a low whistle. "The one who tried to sell raffle tickets at my garden party? Never liked her. How did she die?" "Strangled. Behind the church." "Good heavens. And you're not the prime suspect?" "Not yet," Agatha snapped. "But there's more. Mrs. Bloxby's houseguest, Claire Evans, has vanished, possibly connected." "Ah," said Charles. "A fugitive in the vicarage. How deliciously improper. Want me to come down?" "Don't be silly." "You called me, didn't you? Which means you want an audience." Agatha made an indignant noise. "I want information. Someone must know why Mrs. Fremont was sniffing around that refuge business." Charles's tone brightened. "Refuge business? Oh, darling, you are in deep this time. I'll bring the jag." He hung up before she could protest. Agatha glared at the receiver, torn between annoyance and a faint, shameful flicker of pleasure. Charles's arrival always promised chaos, but also companionship, something she never admitted she needed. Outside, the mist thickened into rain again, soft but insistent. She stood at her window watching the church spire vanish into cloud, her thoughts circling like crows. Was Claire the victim or the villain? And why, in all that godly respectability, did Mrs. Bloxby look so very guilty for doing something good? A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find Doris again, cheeks pink with the thrill of fresh gossip. "They're saying Mrs. Fremont was at the vicarage last night," Doris whispered, "before she died, asking questions about donations." Agatha's pulse quickened. Are they indeed? That's what Mrs. Mason said, and she heard it from the verger's cousin, so it must be true. "Of course," said Agatha. "In Carsely, gossip improves the more it travels." When Doris left, Agatha poured herself another coffee and sat down with a pad of notes. Missing handbag, vanished guest, Mrs. Bloxby evasive. It was shaping up to be the sort of mystery she both dreaded and secretly adored, one that tested loyalty as much as wit. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle. In the quiet, she thought she heard church bells faintly tolling for morning service, solemn and inevitable. Agatha leaned back in her chair and muttered, "Poor Mrs. Fremont, you picked the wrong village to be righteous in." By late morning, when the sky was pretending at spring but the air still bit like January, Agatha Raisin, fortified by coffee and indignation, sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers that refused to form a coherent clue. Her notes on Claire, Harcourt, and the missing handbag lay to one side, a silent insult. She was debating whether to march straight to Nigel Harcourt's Cheltenham office, or to give Bill a piece of her mind first when the doorbell shrieked. "Aggie!" came the cry, bright, theatrical, and unmistakably London. Roy Silver burst in without waiting to be invited, wearing sunglasses the size of teacup saucers and an overcoat that looked imported from a musical about spies. He smelled of city optimism and too much aftershave. "You look ghastly, darling," he declared cheerfully, kissing the air near her cheek. "I came the moment I heard. Murder, scandal, Cotswold chic meets crime noir. It's divine." "It's not divine," snapped Agatha. "It's tragic, and you nearly knocked over my geranium. Oh, the plant will survive. But you, my dear, look like a woman drowning in boredom. Allow me to rescue you. We're going to Cheltenham." "We're what?" "To investigate, obviously. I've got contacts in PR who handle the Helping Hands Foundation, where your little Claire used to work. Word is she wasn't the thief at all. She was the whistleblower, exposed the chairman for cooking the books." Agatha blinked. "Nigel Harcourt?" "That's the one. City type. Posh vowels, oily smile. If you want the truth, we'll find it at the source. My treat. Lunch, martinis, the works." Agatha hesitated, but curiosity was already tugging her like a lead. "All right," she said, standing, "but we're doing this properly. No dramatics." "You wound me," said Roy, striking a tragic pose. "I'll drive." They set off in Roy's little silver convertible, which handled the Cotswold lanes like a prancing foal, all style, no discipline. Agatha gripped the dashboard as Roy narrated his own driving. "Look at me, countryside boy. Smooth as silk, fast as scandal. Slow down before we end up as a press release," Agatha barked. By the time they reached Cheltenham, the sun had staged a feeble appearance. Roy parked outside a sleek cafe and swept Agatha inside as though she were his reluctant client. The place reeked of polished ambition. Mirrored walls, fake ferns, people pretending to take phone calls. Within minutes, Roy had charmed the barista into confessing she once served Harcourt a decaf latte, because he said real caffeine was for peasants. "There you have it," Roy whispered. "Villain confirmed." Agatha rolled her eyes. "You can't solve murder through coffee snobbery." "Watch me." They ordered martinis that arrived in glasses large enough to drown suspicion in. Roy leaned closer. "So, picture it. Claire, sweet little thing, discovers the chairman's been moving charity funds into his own company accounts. She reports him. He denies it. Suddenly she's the thief. Classic corporate deflection. But how does that lead to Mrs. Fremont's murder? Roy shrugged. She probably poked her nose where it didn't belong. Sound familiar? Agatha ignored the jab, though it struck home. After lunch they visited the Foundation's headquarters, all glass and gilt. The receptionist, a woman with the tight smile of professional discretion, tried to fob them off. Roy flashed his press card, expired but impressively laminated, and announced, "Miss Raisin is writing a human interest piece on rural philanthropy." Agatha blinked. "I am?" "Of course you are, darling. You're the moral backbone of Carsely." To Agatha's astonishment, it worked. They were ushered into a waiting room decorated with motivational posters about integrity. Through a glass door, Agatha glimpsed a tall man with slicked hair and a tan that looked purchased. He was laughing into a phone. "That," Roy whispered, "is Harcourt." When he finally joined them, Harcourt exuded charm like cologne, heavy and cloying. "Mrs. Raisin, is it? And Mr. Silver," said Roy, producing his brightest grin. "We're doing a little piece on the charity's invaluable community impact." "Splendid," said Harcourt, settling opposite them. His cufflinks gleamed. "Always happy to help local media." Agatha leaned forward. I understand one of your former accountants, Claire Evans, was involved in a misunderstanding about funds. Ah, yes, Harcourt said smoothly. A regrettable incident. Poor girl panicked under pressure and took liberties with figures. The police will sort it out, I'm sure. Agatha's eyes narrowed. So you deny any irregularities in your accounts? Of course. Everything's transparent. You may quote me. And Mrs. Fremont? His smile froze for a heartbeat, then returned cooler. I met her once at a fundraiser. Awful gossip, that woman. Dreadful habit of exaggeration. Still, tragic what happened. Agatha watched his hands. Perfect manicure, no trace of anxiety, except the way one thumb rubbed his cufflink again and again. Do you know she kept private records, Dep? She asked. Harcourt's voice hardened. I really couldn't say. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another meeting. He stood, shook hands, and left without looking back. Roy exhaled. Well, that was defensive. You could smell guilt from here. Or self-preservation, Agatha murmured. Either way, he's hiding something. As they rose to leave, she noticed a framed photo behind his desk. Harcourt standing beside Mrs. Fremont at a charity gala, both smiling with brittle satisfaction. You see, she whispered, he knew her better than he admits. And she's dead, which means, my darling Aggie, you might actually be onto something. Might? All right, definitely. They drove home as dusk settled over the fields, soft and golden. Agatha felt an odd glow, part triumph, part anxiety. The pieces were shifting, but not yet fitting. Roy chatted about London fashion and how murder mysteries could boost her brand. You should do a podcast, he said. Agatha Raisin, Crimes and Cosmetics. I'd produce it. Roy, if you don't stop talking, I'll commit another murder myself. He laughed, unoffended. At least you'd do it stylishly. By the time they reached Carsely, lamps were twinkling through the drizzle. Roy dropped her outside her gate, blowing kisses into the night air before roaring off toward London and noise. The sudden quiet felt almost accusatory. Agatha turned up her collar and walked toward her door, then stopped. Her garden gate, which she always latched, hung slightly open. The latch dangled, slick with rain. A faint shape stood by the path, half shadow, half lamp glow. Mrs. Bloxby? The vicar's wife stepped forward, pale and tight-lipped, clutching an envelope. I'm so sorry to intrude, Agatha. The police came this afternoon. They've asked me to appear for questioning. Agatha's breath caught. What? They think I may have withheld information about Claire. Oh, Agatha, I don't know what to do. Agatha took her arm, guiding her inside. The kettle went on automatically, comfort's ritual against chaos. You'll do nothing foolish, said Agatha firmly. We'll face this together. Whatever Harcourt and his lot have done, they won't hang it round your neck. Mrs. Bloxby gave a small, helpless smile. You sound quite fierce. Good. Someone has to be. Outside, the drizzle turned to proper rain, drumming softly on the roof. Agatha stared out into the darkness beyond the window, the open gate, the slick path, the unseen watcher she thought she glimpsed near the hedge. When she turned back, Mrs. Bloxby was staring at her hands, whispering a prayer. Agatha reached across and covered them with her own. You may be the soul of Carsely, she said quietly, but even saints need a lawyer sometimes. The next morning brought a watery sunlight that looked apologetic for existing. Carsely glistened faintly after the night's downpour, the hedgerows dripping, the pavements slick with reluctant cheer. Agatha Raisin, having spent half the night rehashing the conversation with Mrs. Bloxby, decided that no self-respecting investigator or friend could let matters sit. By 10 o'clock she was marching up the vicarage path with her jaw set and her umbrella thrust like a weapon. She did not bother to knock. Mrs. Bloxby, found in the kitchen surrounded by the holy trinity of British comfort, tea, custard and moral guilt, looked up with mild resignation. I rather thought you'd come, she said. Then you knew I wouldn't let this go, Agatha replied, hanging up her coat. You've been hiding things and I won't have it. Mrs. Bloxby, serene as a saint in an advert for forgiveness, gestured to the table. Sit down, Agatha. There's custard. It helps with confession. Agatha hesitated. The custard steamed invitingly beside a dish of crumble. I'm furious with you, she said, sitting. I can tell, Mrs. Bloxby said gently. You've brought your cross-examining face. Shall I begin? Agatha folded her arms. You'd better, Mrs. Bloxby sighed. Claire arrived 2 nights before Mrs. Fremont was killed. She told me she'd been accused of theft by her employer, Nigel Harcourt. She was terrified, said he'd threatened to finish what he started if she went to the police. And you believed her? I did. I've seen frightened women before, Agatha. And she didn't want to hide, only to rest before turning herself in. I thought it was decency to give her that much. Decency? Agatha's voice rose. You gave sanctuary to a suspect in my village. Mrs. Bloxby poured tea with unhurried grace. She was not a suspect then, only a young woman frightened of a powerful man. Agatha opened her mouth for a retort, then closed it again. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples made indignation harder to sustain. And when Mrs. Fremont was murdered? Mrs. Bloxby looked down at her hands. Claire was gone. I found her note that morning, apologizing, saying she couldn't bear to bring more trouble upon us. I think she meant to go to the police, but she never made it. Agatha stirred her custard, not tasting it. You could have told me. I thought you'd do precisely what you're doing now, Mrs. Bloxby said softly, charging into things, and perhaps putting yourself in danger. Better me than you, Agatha muttered. Nonsense, you'd hate being left out. Despite herself, Agatha laughed. All right, that's true, but you were reckless, my dear. If Harcourt's as nasty as he sounds... Mrs. Bloxby reached into a drawer and produced the letter they'd already discussed. She laid it on the table, then another item, a torn scrap of paper, faintly oily from handling. What's that? A piece of a donation envelope I found in the church postbox this morning. The handwriting... Agatha leaned in. The elegant, slanted letters read, Murfield Women's Refuge, personal contribution. Is the same as on the anonymous note, Mrs. Bloxby finished. Agatha squinted, her detective's vanity engaged. You're right. The loops on the F and Y, identical. And the ink's the same shade of blue. Expensive pen. The sort of pen, Mrs. Bloxby said quietly, used by someone like Nigel Harcourt. A chill ran through the kitchen, though the oven hummed warm. So, said Agatha, he sends the refuge money to look generous, then sends a threat to keep you quiet. Charming combination. Mrs. Bloxby nodded. I fear he followed Claire here. If he thought she'd talk to me, he may have silenced the wrong woman, Agatha finished grimly. The kettle whistled, and for a moment they said nothing, the quiet filled only by the ticking clock and the faint crackle of rain against the window. Agatha's anger had softened into something uncomfortably close to sympathy. She'd always admired Mrs. Bloxby's calm, but she'd never seen the cost of it until now. The exhaustion behind her eyes, the tremor of someone who bore other people's secrets as if they were laundry she must keep clean. You should have told Bill, Agatha said at last. I will now, but I hoped it could be resolved without ruining Claire's reputation. If Harcourt's guilty, he'll ruin far more than reputations. Mrs. Bloxby smiled faintly. And yet you'll find him, won't you? Agatha felt her usual pride prickled with guilt. You make it sound as if I'm chasing glory. Aren't you? Agatha laughed dryly. Maybe, but someone's got to do it. Bill means well, but he's bound by rules. You and I aren't. Mrs. Bloxby raised an eyebrow. I broke one already. You disapprove. I disapprove because you did it better than I would have, said Agatha, surprising herself. You act out of kindness. I act because I can't stand not knowing. Mrs. Bloxby's eyes softened. They're two sides of the same thing, perhaps. Curiosity and compassion. Agatha shrugged. If you say so. They lingered over custard and moral ambiguity, the kitchen growing dimmer as clouds gathered again. The vicar's distant voice drifted from his study, reading aloud his sermon to the cat, which was ignoring him. He still doesn't know? Agatha asked. Only that something troubles me. I shall tell him once I've told the truth to the police. Well, if you must confess, do it over pudding, Agatha said. It makes people less cross. That works on you, at least, said Mrs. Bloxby with gentle humour. Agatha smiled, spoon poised. You're forgiven, temporarily. Thank you, I think. As the afternoon settled into its quiet rhythm, Agatha wandered to the window. The vicarage garden was soaked and glistening. The first daffodils drooped like tired parishioners. For a moment she felt the ache of something she rarely admitted, loneliness. All her investigations, her sharpness and wit, her small victories, they meant little without someone to steady her. She turned back to find Mrs. Bloxby watching her with that disconcerting understanding. You do care more than you pretend, you know, said Mrs. Bloxby. Agatha sniffed. Rubbish. I'm just nosy. Nosy and kind, Mrs. Bloxby corrected. Don't spread that about, Agatha said, but her voice was softer. The spell of calm was broken by the phone ringing. Mrs. Bloxby answered, her hand trembling slightly. Yes? Oh, Sergeant Wong, of course. Agatha straightened instantly. Yes, Mrs. Bloxby continued. She's here. One moment. She held out the receiver. It's for you. Agatha grabbed it. Bill, what's happened? We've found Claire Evans, said Bill. His tone was brisk but heavy. She was discovered early this morning near the Mercester railway siding, unconscious. Looks like she's been there all night. Alive? Barely, but yes. Paramedics are taking her to hospital. Looks like she was running, maybe from someone. Agatha's mind raced. Harcourt? Could be, or could be whoever's been using her name to hide their fraud. I'll know more soon. And Agatha, don't interfere. Bill, have I ever? Constantly, he said, and hung up. Agatha stood staring at the phone, her heart thudding in a rhythm she pretended was only excitement. Mrs. Bloxby's face was pale but resolute. She's alive, she whispered. Thank God. For now, said Agatha. She turned to the window again, watching the rain restart its steady patter, as if the heavens had resumed their investigation too. You realize what this means, she said quietly. If Claire didn't kill Mrs. Fremont, someone's still out there, and they've just failed once. Mrs. Bloxby's eyes widened. Do you think he'll try again? If he thinks she can talk, Agatha said grimly, I'd bet my last lipstick on it. There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Bloxby, ever practical even in fear, reached for the custard bowl and spooned a final helping. Eat something, she said. You'll think more clearly on a full stomach. Agatha sat, half laughing despite herself. You're unbelievable. The world's collapsing and you offer pudding. It's what I know, said Mrs. Bloxby simply. Agatha met her eyes. Then keep doing it. I'll handle the rest. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills, a polite warning of storms to come. And in the warm kitchen, Agatha Raisin, full of custard and curiosity, began planning the next move. Morning came grey and grudging, as if the sky itself disapproved of everything that had happened so far. Agatha Raisin, who had managed only 3 hours of fretful sleep, looked in the mirror and muttered, You look like sin wrapped in puff pastry. A strong cup of coffee improved neither her mood nor her face. The phone rang at 8. Bill Wong's voice came down the line, clipped and weary. Claire Evans is awake. Agatha set her mug down sharply. Thank God. What's her condition? Concussion, mild hypothermia, and some memory loss. Claims she doesn't remember much before collapsing near the siding. And yet she managed to get herself to Mercester. Apparently. The doctors say she was running from someone. We're heading to interview her at the hospital. I thought you'd want to. Be there? I'm already putting on my lipstick. Bill sighed audibly. Please, Agatha, no dramatics. Let me handle it. You always say that, and I never do, she replied sweetly, and hung up. By 10 o'clock she was striding through Mercester General in her best attempt at sympathetic investigator attire, navy coat, sensible heels, and a hat that refused to cooperate with the hospital's revolving door. It caught in the glass, spun her half round, and deposited her back where she'd started. Oh, for heaven's sake, she barked. A passing nurse suppressed a laugh. That way, madam. Yes, thank you, I know which way, said Agatha, adjusting the hat with wounded dignity. When she finally located Claire's ward, Bill was already seated beside the bed, notebook open. Claire lay propped against crisp pillows, her face drawn and pale, but no longer terrified. Mrs. Raisin, Bill said warningly, as if introducing a known hazard. Agatha ignored him. Claire, my dear, you gave us quite a fright. Claire managed a small smile. I didn't mean to. I thought if I could get to the police myself it would look better. But then... She faltered, gaze unfocused. Everything went fuzzy. I remember headlights, someone shouting, and then nothing until now. Try to think, Bill urged gently. Do you remember seeing anyone in Carsely the night before you left? Anyone you recognized? Claire frowned. There was a car, grey, parked near the church. Mrs. Fremont was talking to someone inside. They were arguing. Agatha's pulse quickened. Did you see who it was? No, but I heard her say, You'll ruin everything if you go through with it. And then he said something about shutting her up. Did you catch his voice? Asked Agatha. Deep, Claire murmured. Educated. The sort of man who sounds sure he's right. Bill scribbled. That's not much to go on. It's enough, said Agatha. A grey car and arrogance sounds exactly like Nigel Harcourt. You can't assume that, said Bill, exasperated. Why not? He's got a chauffeur-driven Bentley the colour of moral compromise. Bill groaned. Aggie. But Agatha was already at the window, peering down at the hospital car park. There, gleaming even under clouded light, was a grey Bentley. A tall man stood beside it, talking on his phone. Well, speak of the devil, she whispered. Bill joined her, frowning. That's Harcourt. What the hell's he doing here? Visiting a patient, perhaps? Or checking that one can't talk? Bill snapped his notebook shut. I'll have a word. Oh, do be careful, said Agatha. He's the sort who smiles while he's lying. I deal with that every day, Bill said dryly, and left the ward. Agatha turned back to Claire. You're quite sure Mrs. Fremont was alive that night? Yes. She said she was meeting someone about the accounts. She was angry. I think she wanted to prove she'd been right about the missing funds. And you told Mrs. Bloxby? Claire nodded weakly. She believed me. No one else would. Agatha's heart softened, then immediately rehardened out of habit. Well, you're safe now. I'll see to that. Claire smiled faintly. You're very fierce, Mrs. Raisin. Only when necessary, Agatha replied, though she knew it was a lie. Downstairs she found Bill and Harcourt in polite conversation by the hospital doors. The man was even slicker up close, immaculate suit, too white smile, confidence that could have been bottled and sold as repellent. Ah, Mrs. Raisin, he said smoothly, we meet again. You do get around. I could say the same for you, Agatha replied. Visiting a friend? A colleague, actually. One of our board members took ill last week. He turned to Bill with a look of professional weariness. I do hope you don't suspect me of loitering at every crime scene in Gloucestershire. No one said crime scene, Bill replied, but his tone was flat. Then I'll take my leave, said Harcourt. Do give Mrs. Bloxby my regards. Such a charming woman, so loyal. He stepped into his Bentley and shut the door with an elegant, expensive click. The car pulled away, tyres hissing on wet tarmac. Agatha followed it with her eyes, narrowing them like a hawk spotting a mouse. You saw that? She said. Saw what? The mud on his tyres, thick, reddish, churchyard grit. I'd know that colour anywhere. You think he drove there the night of the murder? Or this morning, to check something he shouldn't? Bill shook his head. We'll need more than poetic mud comparisons for evidence. You're impossible, Agatha muttered. And you're reckless, he said, but without heat. At least I'm something. On the drive back to Carsely, drizzle turned the countryside into a blurred watercolour. Agatha's thoughts churned faster than the wipers. If Harcourt had been in Carsely the night Mrs. Fremont died, then everything fit. His threatened reputation, Claire's terror, Mrs. Bloxby's warning letter. But proving it would take more than sharp eyes and sarcasm. She pulled into her driveway just as the first drops became proper rain. The cottage windows glowed warmly, a comforting lie. She entered, shook off her coat, and switched on the kettle. Fritz, her neighbour's cat, an uninvited boarder, appeared from under the table, meowing reproachfully. Don't start with me, said Agatha. I've had a day of liars. She made tea and sat at her desk, spreading out her notes. Harcourt's connection to the charity, Mrs. Fremont's records, Claire's testimony. One thread linked them all. Money. And wherever money lurked, vanity and vengeance followed close behind. The rain thickened, drumming against the window like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the lane a car engine passed slowly, then stopped. Agatha frowned. Too early for post, too late for visitors. She rose, looked out. Nothing but darkness and rain. You're getting jumpy, she muttered. But when she turned back to her desk, her papers had shifted. Just slightly. A corner turned, a pen rolled. She froze. Hello? Silence. Only the kettle's low hum. Heart thudding, she crept to the hall. The front door was ajar by an inch, rain glistening on the threshold. A draught stirred the curtains like whispering fingers. She stepped forward, then stopped. Her folder, the one marked Harcourt, confidential, was gone. Agatha stared at the empty desk, fury and fear knotting together. Whoever had entered hadn't touched her handbag, her jewellery, or the cash tray. Only the notes. She slammed the door, locked it twice, and stood breathing hard. "So, it's a game now," she said aloud. "Fine. I've never lost one yet." 10 minutes later, she was on the phone to Charles. "Someone's broken into my cottage," she said. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly, except my investigative brilliance has been stolen." They took the notes. Every page on Harcourt, the rest untouched. "That rather narrows your suspect list," he said. "Exactly, and he'll regret it." "You realize this might be dangerous, Aggie." "Oh, Charles, danger keeps my blood pressure at a socially acceptable level." "You're impossible," he said fondly. "So people keep telling me." When she hung up, the rain had eased, leaving the night heavy and damp. She checked every latch twice before sitting by the fire with a whiskey she pretended was medicinal. Mrs. Bloxby's voice echoed in her mind. Kindness can be misinterpreted. Agatha stared into the flames, thinking how often her own curiosity had been misinterpreted too, by others, by herself. But she couldn't stop now, not when the truth was this close and someone clearly desperate to keep it hidden. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of an engine fading into the distance. Agatha smiled grimly. "Run while you can, Harcourt," she said. "I've got your mud, and I'll find your soul to match." She blew out the lamp, leaving the room half lit by the fire's glow, warm, defiant, and quietly dangerous. The next afternoon arrived crisp and cold, the sort of day that pretends at calm but hums faintly with tension. Agatha Raisin, standing at her front window, could see the first flecks of frost beginning to form on the vicarage hedge. She took this as an omen, nature itself bracing for confrontation. "A tea of goodwill," she muttered, straightening the lace cloth over her table. If goodwill's present, it's hiding under the scones." Charles Frayth lounged in her armchair, radiating unhelpful serenity. "You do realize," he drawled, "that inviting a potential murderer for tea is not a recognized police strategy." "You'd rather I sent him an email?" "I'd rather you didn't provoke him while I'm in the blast radius." Agatha adjusted a vase of daffodils with unnecessary precision. "We've proof enough to rattle him. The handwriting, the mud, Claire's statement. I just need him to slip." Charles yawned. "You'll never make him slip. He's too smooth. He'll charm you, flatter you, and leave with half the biscuits." "Then you can play distraction," she said. "Smile, pour tea, and look harmless." "I was born harmless," he said. "You were born charming," Agatha retorted. "That's worse." The bell rang. Agatha's heart gave a traitorous flutter. She smoothed her skirt, checked her lipstick, and reminded herself that vanity was only a vice if one lost focus. Mrs. Bloxby entered first, composed as ever, followed by Nigel Harcourt, immaculate suit, shark smile. He carried a small bouquet, the social assassin's calling card. "Mrs. Raisin," he said, his tone oiled to perfection, "how kind of you to invite me. A rare pleasure to be welcomed rather than suspected." Agatha smiled with brittle brightness. "We're civilized in Carsely. Tea before truth, that's our motto." "Ah, truth," said Harcourt, setting down the flowers. "So subjective, don't you find?" Charles poured tea with languid precision. "Milk? Sugar? Moral absolution?" "Just milk, thank you," Harcourt replied, unbothered. Mrs. Bloxby sat beside the hearth, her posture quiet but steady. Agatha could feel the woman's presence like a calm anchor amid the unease. "You've been very brave," Harcourt said to her with that smile that never reached his eyes. "Sheltering that girl. Must have been quite trying." "Not brave," said Mrs. Bloxby softly. "Just unwilling to see an innocent punished." "Innocent?" His voice carried a silky edge. "How fortunate you're so certain. Many people prefer facts to faith." "Faith can be fact, Mr. Harcourt," she said mildly. "You might be surprised how often it is." Agatha hid a grin behind her teacup. She'd seen Mrs. Bloxby soothe angry parishioners and drunk bell-ringers, but this quiet defiance had steel under the velvet. "Tell me," Agatha said lightly, "you were acquainted with Mrs. Fremont, weren't you?" "We'd met," he said smoothly. "She was efficient, if somewhat self-righteous." "Righteousness does make poor company," Agatha said, "though it's often fashionable among those with something to hide." Charles coughed pointedly, as if to say too soon. Harcourt's expression didn't falter, but his hand paused mid-sip. "I hope that's not an accusation, Mrs. Raisin." "Oh, heavens, no," she said sweetly. "Just an observation. I find gossip often circles round the wrong people." He smiled again, thin and deliberate. Indeed, I know how to keep gossip quiet, Mrs. Raisin, and troublesome women too. The air in the room tightened. Mrs. Bloxby's eyes lifted. That sounds almost like a threat. Merely experience, Betahan, he said. In my world, one must manage noise. Yes, said Agatha, but you'll find Carsely isn't fond of being managed. Charles broke the silence with the clink of a teaspoon. More cake? He asked brightly. It's safer than conversation. Thank you, said Harcourt. As he reached for a slice, the cuff of his immaculate shirt slid back, and Agatha saw it. The flash of gold, the engraved letters, M.F. Her breath caught, Mrs. Fremont's initials. She stared, willing herself not to react. Her pulse thrummed so loudly she feared the teacups would rattle. Charles followed her gaze and, bless him, moved in immediately with the full arsenal of aristocratic distraction. "You must tell me, Harcourt," he said in that lazy drawl. "Is it true your Bentley once belonged to a cabinet minister? It smells of self-importance." Harcourt laughed, preening slightly. "It did, actually. The late Lord Withers. Very discerning man." "And the mud on the tyres," Charles continued. "A new fashion statement." "Ah, the country roads," Harcourt said. "I had to detour through a village. Carsely, I believe. Dreadful place for puddles." Agatha set down her cup before it betrayed her trembling hand. "You drove through Carsely? Recently?" "Yesterday morning, in fact. Business errand. Nothing of note." "Of course," she murmured. "Nothing of note at all." Mrs. Bloxby's tone was mild but firm. "You should take care on our roads, Mr. Harcourt. They have a way of revealing where one's been." Harcourt glanced at her then, and for the briefest instant something cold flickered behind the charm. "I'm sure they do," he said. The tension held like a tight string. Then Charles leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "Well, if this is diplomacy, I'm exhausted. Another cup, anyone?" Agatha forced herself to smile. "Yes, more tea, though it seems to have gone a little cold." By the time Harcourt rose to leave, the politeness between them had frozen to crystal. He shook hands all round, his smile as glossy as the Bentley waiting outside. "Such a pleasure, Mrs. Raisin. Always invigorating to meet women of spirit." "Likewise," she said evenly. "Do drive safely. The roads can be treacherous, especially near the church." He paused, eyes narrowing fractionally, then nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." When the door closed, Agatha let out the breath she'd been hoarding. "He's guilty as sin," she said. "We don't know that yet," said Mrs. Bloxby gently. "Oh, come now," said Charles. "The man practically monologued about silencing women. If he'd twirled a moustache, it would have been perfect theatre." "And that cufflink," Agatha said, pacing. "M.F., Mrs. Fremont's initials, no mistake. He's kept it as a trophy." "Or bought it at a charity shop," Charles suggested. Agatha shot him a look. "I'll throttle you next." "Darling, you wouldn't. I'm far too pretty." Mrs. Bloxby rose, smoothing her skirt. Her calm seemed deeper now, less fragile. "We can't act without proof," she said, "but I think he knows we're watching." "Good," said Agatha. "Let him squirm." "Be careful," said Mrs. Bloxby. "Cornered men lash out." Agatha's expression softened. "I'll mind myself, but you must promise the same." Mrs. Bloxby smiled faintly. "I don't need promises, Agatha. Just courage." They stood together by the window, watching the Bentley glide down the lane, its silver body merging with the dull winter light. "Some rules are worth bending," Mrs. Bloxby murmured, her voice barely above the ticking clock. Agatha turned to her. "Meaning?" "If truth must stand upright," Mrs. Bloxby said, "sometimes one must stoop a little to lift it." Agatha gave a small, crooked smile. "You know, for a vicar's wife, you make an excellent conspirator." "Don't tell the bishop," said Mrs. Bloxby. "He'd faint at the thought of moral flexibility," said Charles, "which incidentally is why I avoid church." "Among other reasons," said Agatha dryly. The three of them stood for a moment in the cooling light, the tea untouched, the air still vibrating faintly from what had passed. Outside, the frost thickened, turning the garden white around the edges. Agatha looked at the untouched pot and muttered, half to herself, "Even tea gives up warmth in this village before the truth does." And as the last steam faded from the cups, she knew the game had changed. The next move would not be polite, but it would be hers. The fog came early that night, soft and deliberate, as though it had been summoned by Agatha Raisin herself. Carsely disappeared inch by inch, hedgerows blurred, street lamps smothered, the church spire reduced to a ghostly outline. It was, Agatha thought with grim satisfaction, perfect weather for justice. "You know," said Charles Frayth, leaning against a gravestone, "if we're caught skulking about a churchyard at midnight, I shall tell the police you dragged me here under false pretences." "You're already an accessory," said Agatha, peering through the mist. "You may as well be useful." "Useful?" he echoed. "I brought the torch and the flask of brandy. What more do you want? A choir?" "Less noise," hissed Agatha. "You sound like a pantomime villain." "That's rich, coming from the woman plotting an ambush in a cemetery." Bill Wong, crouched beside the low wall, gave an exasperated sigh. "Could you two stop bickering for 5 minutes? We're supposed to be watching for Harcourt, not entertaining him." Agatha scowled but fell silent. Somewhere beyond the lich gate, a car door shut softly. "That's him," she whispered. The fog swirled and the sound of footsteps echoed faintly on gravel. Measured, deliberate, too confident for a villager. Nigel Harcourt was punctual, even for crime. Agatha crouched lower behind the monument to St. Swithin, ignoring the unpleasant damp creeping up her coat. Charles leaned beside her, the torch off but ready. "Remind me why we're hiding instead of just calling the police," he murmured. "Because I want to see the smugness leave his face," Agatha said. "The police can have him afterward." "And if you're wrong?" "I'm never wrong," she said, though the fog didn't seem to believe her. The faint beam of a torch flickered near the vestry door. Harcourt moved briskly, his expensive coat ghostly in the mist. He crouched, lifted one of the paving slabs and reached down. "He's retrieving something," whispered Bill. "Evidence," Agatha breathed. "The ledgers Mrs. Fremont kept." A second sound interrupted her triumph. Footsteps approaching from the opposite side. Bill's hand shot up in warning. From the shadows emerged the vicar, in dressing gown and overcoat, holding a lantern aloft like an offended saint. "What on earth?" the vicar began. "Who's there? I received a note." "Oh, damn," muttered Agatha. "A forged note. He's going to ruin everything." Harcourt straightened sharply, the slab half up. The two men froze, caught in the absurd intimacy of crime and confusion. "Reverend," said Harcourt smoothly, "what a surprise. I was told you needed me urgently." "You?" the vicar blinked. "At this hour? And why are you prizing up my paving stones?" Agatha decided it was time for subtlety to die a quick death. She stood, brushed off her knees, and stepped into the lantern light. "Because, Reverend," she said crisply, "our Mr. Harcourt was hoping to reclaim what Mrs. Fremont stole before he strangled her for it." Harcourt turned, his mask of charm cracking just enough to reveal the man beneath, defensive, dangerous, desperate. "Mrs. Raisin," he said, voice low. "Still peddling melodrama, I see." "Only when it fits the facts," she said. "And what facts would those be?" "The cufflink with Mrs. Fremont's initials," she snapped. "The forged donation letter, the threats to Mrs. Bloxby, and your very convenient mud tracks from Carsely churchyard. Shall I go on?" "Please don't," said Charles under his breath. "She will." The vicar's lantern trembled slightly. "Nigel, is this true?" "Utter nonsense," Harcourt said smoothly, but there was a crack of strain in his tone. "I came because I received a message claiming evidence had been hidden here, something to exonerate me. And now, Mrs. Raisin, here you are playing amateur detective for attention again." "Attention?" Agatha flared. "I'm trying to stop you burying your conscience under holy ground." "You've no proof," he said. "No," she admitted, stepping closer. "But you do. And you were fool enough to come fetch it." Bill emerged then, torch on, his expression hard. "We can fix that. You're under arrest for—" "Hold it!" Harcourt barked, hand diving inside his coat. Agatha froze, heart thudding. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out the ledger, worn leather, edges damp with fog. He held it like a talisman. "You want proof? Here's your proof." His voice cracked, bitter. "Every penny accounted for, not a crime among them, only the crime of wasting charity on failures and frauds." "You mean people in need?" said Mrs. Bloxby's voice quietly. They all turned. She had appeared from the mist like a calm ghost, her coat buttoned, her face unreadable. "You knew this would end here," she said. "Mrs. Bloxby," Harcourt began, his tone shifting to coaxing, "surely you understand. You saw what kind of people come begging to your door. Liars, cheats. And saints sometimes, she said, but never monsters. Not until tonight. He flinched as though struck. You killed Mrs. Fremont, she continued softly. Not for money, for pride, because she threatened to expose your hypocrisy. She was destroying everything I'd built, he snapped. My reputation, my standing. Your vanity, Agatha said sharply. That's what she threatened. Harcourt's breath came fast. You think I meant to kill her? She was shouting, waving her ridiculous records. She slipped. I tried to stop her, but... You strangled her, Bill said flatly. The silence that followed was heavy, shaped by fog and regret. Then Agatha's heel chose that moment to betray her with a loud crack. She wobbled, caught Charles's arm and muttered, Typical, the height of drama, and I'm doing slapstick. Charles grinned despite himself. Even your shoes make an entrance. Harcourt gave a short, mirthless laugh. You're all absurd, playing morality in the mud. Do you think anyone will thank you for dragging this into the light? No, said Mrs. Bloxby quietly, but it must be done anyway. Something in her voice, calm, inexorable, broke him more effectively than Bill's authority or Agatha's fury. His shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to, he said hoarsely. She mocked me, said I was a fraud. I only wanted her to stop shouting. She fell, and then it was too late. I hid the ledger here. I thought if no one found it, they'd never trace the transfers. They'll trace you instead, Agatha said. Bill stepped forward. That's enough, Mr. Harcourt. You can tell the rest at the station. The fog pressed close again as he led the man toward the gate, the beam of his torch cutting through the white haze like an accusation. When the noise had faded, Agatha sat heavily on a gravestone, tugging off her broken heel. The absurdity of it all, fog, confession and footwear, washed over her. Well, said Charles, hands in his pockets, I must say, it's been more entertaining than my last dinner party. You'd say that if you were buried alive, Agatha retorted. True, he said cheerfully. Mrs. Bloxby stood by the church door, eyes on the place where Harcourt had knelt. He'll go to prison, she said quietly, and his charity will collapse. Good riddance, said Agatha. It wasn't charity, it was vanity with stationery. Perhaps, said Mrs. Bloxby, but there'll be women who needed that refuge, and no one to help them now. Agatha looked away, uncomfortable. You can't save everyone. No, Mrs. Bloxby said softly, but we're meant to try. The vicar reappeared, his lantern trembling again, this time with fury rather than fear. Margaret, you never told me any of this. Harbouring suspects, lying to the police, what have you done? My duty, she said simply. He stared, lost for words. Agatha rose, brushing fog from her coat. If you'll take my advice, Reverend, which I admit you won't, give her a little grace. She's earned more than you ever will preaching it. The vicar drew himself up, sputtered something about propriety, and stormed off toward the rectory. Charles gave a low whistle. Well handled, Aggie. If this detective business ever dries up, you could run couples therapy. Don't tempt me, said Agatha. The living are worse than the dead. They walked together to the lich gate as dawn began to dilute the fog, turning it gold at the edges. The first bird stirred. The world was beginning to forget the night. Mrs. Bloxby lingered by the gate. Thank you, Agatha, for standing by me even when I didn't deserve it. Agatha sniffed. Nonsense, you always deserve it. I just don't always realize it in time. That's friendship, said Mrs. Bloxby. That's exhaustion, said Agatha. I need a bath and several gin tonics. Charles smiled, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Come on, old girl. Breakfast at my place. No corpses, I promise. You always promise that, she said, and I almost always deliver. They walked away from the church, shoes crunching on the gravel, their breath misting in the faint light. Behind them, Mrs. Bloxby paused once more at the gate, looking up toward the bell tower. The fog was thinning, but the village still slept, unaware as ever that its peace had been bought at such untidy cost. Agatha glanced back, watching her friend's small figure framed against the dawn. You know, she murmured, for someone who bends the rules, she makes the rest of us look crooked. Charles gave her a sideways look. And you wouldn't have it any other way. Agatha smiled faintly. No, she said, not for all the headlines in Gloucestershire. The first chime of morning bells drifted through the mist, soft, forgiving, and almost ironic. Agatha listened, her broken heel dangling from her hand, and thought that perhaps redemption, like tea, was best served hot, but never without a little bitterness. Early spring had returned to Carsely, a polite, tentative sort of season, full of apologies for winter. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. Daffodils trembled on verges like gossiping villagers uncertain of their welcome. For the first time in weeks, the village was at peace. Nigel Harcourt awaited trial in London. Claire Evans, pale but determined, was now working at the women's refuge Mrs. Bloxby had championed, sending postcards written in a shaky but hopeful hand. The vicar had retreated into sulky sermon writing, taking refuge in theology and self-pity. The world, Agatha Raisin thought, was back to its usual muddled self. She stood in her kitchen that afternoon, regarding a tin of assorted biscuits with an expression of mischief. The tin rattled faintly when moved, for inside, nestled between shortbread fingers, was a small bottle of Bombay Sapphire gin. Peace offerings should be both symbolic and medicinal, she muttered. Charles, sprawled in her armchair reading the Times, looked up. "You're taking gin to the vicarage. How ecumenical of you." "Not for him, for Mrs. Bloxby. I'm conducting moral diplomacy." "You mean an apology?" Agatha sniffed. "Apologies are vulgar. I prefer reparations in liquid form." Charles grinned. "You do have your own theology, don't you?" "It works," said Agatha briskly. She grabbed her coat. "And don't touch the biscuits while I'm gone. They're evidence." The vicarage garden was recovering from scandal much as the village was, cautiously. Crocuses edged through the grass, defiant against the mud. Mrs. Bloxby opened the door herself, calm as ever, though her face showed a new weariness that only kindness brings. "Agatha," she said with a smile that warmed the air, "you shouldn't have troubled yourself." "I did," said Agatha, handing her the tin. "Peace on earth and a little gin to help it along." Mrs. Bloxby laughed softly. "You shouldn't encourage me. The bishop already thinks I'm eccentric." "You're not eccentric," said Agatha, stepping inside. "You're dangerously good. It frightens men." "It frightens you too, sometimes," Mrs. Bloxby said gently. Agatha grinned. "Only when I'm sober." They settled in the sitting room, the familiar vicarage comfort restored, the ticking clock, the faint scent of furniture polish, a cat dozing on the windowsill like moral approval in fur. Mrs. Bloxby poured tea. "The papers are full of the trial already," she said. "Such speculation. They can't decide whether to pity him or despise him." "Despise," said Agatha firmly. "Anyone who lectures on morality while embezzling deserves neither pity nor a platform." "Still," Mrs. Bloxby said, stirring her cup, "he believed he was doing right. That's the dreadful thing about self-righteousness. It feels so virtuous." "So does vanity," Agatha said, then smiled ruefully. "I'd know. You're not vain, Agatha, just visible." "That's the kindest insult I've had all week." They laughed. The sound, light and genuine, filled the room like forgiveness. After a while, silence settled comfortably between them. Through the window, the churchyard lay peaceful under a wash of sunlight. "You were very brave," Agatha said at last. "Defying your husband, the police, everyone. I envy you." Mrs. Bloxby looked startled. "Envy me? For what?" "For having courage that looks like grace. I'm all bluster and threats. You're calm as a saint with a good tailor." Mrs. Bloxby's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I envy your honesty. You say what others only think, and you act when others hesitate." "Yes, and it lands me in the middle of murder investigations," said Agatha. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Bloxby, "but at least the truth moves because of you." Agatha sipped her tea, uncomfortable with praise. "Truth always makes a mess," she said. "You tidy it. I just stir it." "We need both," Mrs. Bloxby said. "Otherwise nothing changes." They shared a quiet moment, the kind of stillness that feels like the world exhaling. Outside, the church bells began to toll the quarter hour, patient, forgiving. Agatha glanced at the biscuit tin. "You know," she said, "if the vicar doesn't drink gin, I'll happily help dispose of it." Mrs. Bloxby smiled. "Then we must find a reason to celebrate. Perhaps forgiveness?" "Forgiveness is overrated," said Agatha, though her eyes softened. "But I'll drink to friendship." "And small mercies," said Mrs. Bloxby. "And the next scandal," Agatha added. Mrs. Bloxby laughed again, a proper, unguarded laugh this time. When the teapot had cooled and the cat had resumed its purring dominance, Agatha stood to leave. She hesitated by the doorway, studying her friend's calm face. "You know," she said, "I was furious with you for keeping secrets. But you were right, about compassion, about patience. If I ever get that sensible, promise to stop me." "I promise," said Mrs. Bloxby, "and you must promise to keep charging ahead. Someone has to shake the dust off this village." "Oh, I will," said Agatha, tugging on her coat. "Trouble and I are old companions." As she stepped outside, Mrs. Bloxby called after her, "Try to let Bill handle the next case." "Nonsense," Agatha called back. "He'd only make it dull." The vicar's study door creaked open as Agatha passed. He glowered briefly before retreating into a cloud of theological gloom. She resisted the urge to salute him with the biscuit tin. Back in her own kitchen, Agatha set the Carsely Chronicle on the table beside her tea. The headline, half hidden under a scone crumb, read, "Mysterious Visitor at Anscombe Hall. Police Puzzled." Agatha smiled slowly. "Peace never lasts here," she said to the empty room. The kettle hissed as if in agreement. She poured herself another cup, humming under her breath. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, a car backfired, and life, blessed, ordinary, nosy life, went on. Agatha raised her cup in a solitary toast. "To tea," she said softly. "Truth and very small forgivenesses." Then she drank, and the village exhaled with her, content for now and waiting, as ever, for whatever came next.